crisis brought on by inflation, not a crisis that's the result of a deliberate policy to put a recession in place to control inflation. It's a crisis that is the result of excessive optimism, leading to an overextension of debt, overextension of investment. And the result of that crisis is that the usual response to a global downturn is no longer available. We have relied for a long time on central banks to solve our problems. We've taken it for granted that Mr. Greenspan or Mr. Bernanke or Mr. Duesenberg or Mr. Trichet can deal with any downturn simply by cutting interest rates, which is ordinarily a very potent tool of policy. But in the current crisis, unfortunately, that conventional tool is largely exhausted, which is something that hasn't happened for a long time. And if I were going to say, I would say that the scariest picture that I know is this one. These are U.S. short-term interest rates. The United States has gone the full distance. Europe, the Eurozone, not quite yet, but pretty close. These are the interest rates, in effect, that the Federal Reserve can set. And when we had a crisis in the early 1980s, the Federal Reserve was able to respond by cutting interest rates because they were very high. Even in the early 1990s, or for that matter at the beginning of this decade, the Federal Reserve was able to respond by cutting rates, as was the European Central Bank, as was the Bank of Japan, or the Bank of England. Today, for the first time since the 1930s, we have no more ability to cut interest rates. And that's the core of why this is so frightening. We have exhausted all of our usual ammunition. We have used all of our usual tools, and still the world economy is contracting rapidly. One more picture to drive home the gravity. And this takes a little explaining. We have, for the United States, and reasonably well for other powers, we have a rule of thumb that helps us understand what the policy of the central bank ought to be. It's called the Taylor rule. It says that depending upon the rate of inflation and depending upon the state of the economy, you can say what the interest rate ought to be. And it is possible to apply the Taylor rule. It actually fits U.S. policy quite closely in the past. It's possible to say what that rule tells us about what we ought to be doing next. So this is actually from analysts at Goldman Sachs. Their numbers are not very different from other people's. The gray line represents what the interest rate ought to be according to this rule of thumb. The black line represents what the interest rate actually is. And as you can see, the Federal Reserve has pretty much followed the rule up to this point. But if we take reasonable projections about the state of the economy over the next 2 years, what they say is that the Federal Reserve ought to cut the interest rate to minus 8%, which of course you can't do. This is the point. You cannot have a negative interest rate for more than an instant because people will accumulate cash instead. In fact, that is happening. There's been a sharp increase in the amount of cash, literal pieces of paper with pictures of dead presidents on it that people are holding. And this is an indication that we have reached the limits. There's no more we can do. We have the conventional policy response is no longer available. Now, in a way, since this is a conference on innovation, that should be slightly encouraging. We need to be innovative in our policies. And the test for the world is whether, in fact, officials whether our leaders will be sufficiently innovative to do what is necessary to deal with this crisis. I was about to say an unprecedented crisis. It's actually not unprecedented. There is a precedent, which is the Great Depression. But we would hope that we have an unprecedented response to the crisis, which is enough to avoid having a repeat of that Great Depression. We are seeing substantial innovation in policy. Let me say that although there has been much criticism of all of our economic leaders, I believe that some of them are doing quite a lot to fight this crisis. I am rather a supporter of Mr. Bernanke at the Federal Reserve, which is partly because I think he is the right man for the job, although it's a very difficult job. Partly because before he was demoted to his current position, he was a professor at Princeton University, which is where I also teach. In fact, he hired. Deflation is a very discouraging thing for economic activity. It raises the burden of debt on those who owe money. It raises the cost of borrowing because you need to repay dollars or euros that are worth more than the dollars or euros that you borrow. It's a depressing factor on the economy. We need very strong action to avoid deflation. If we don't, the crisis will be much harder to resolve. It will be a very difficult thing for us to get through. So as I said, we are seeing a policy response. We've certainly seen, this was, again, the innovative policies by the American Central Bank, less so the European Central Bank. Be helpful if we had more innovation on this side of the Atlantic. We're also seeing a turn towards fiscal expansion. Quite dramatic in the United States, less so elsewhere.